Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about the intersection of AI and storage and a lot of the implications that are coming out of that. There's the buzzy new topics that are sort of kicking around on the AI side with what gets seen as sort of the staid, reliable part of IT, the storage business. And what does that really mean in terms of what we have to look at, what we have to do, and more importantly, where do we need to spend? And to discuss this lively topic with me are returning guests, Henry Baltazar and Jim Curtis. Welcome back to the podcast, you both.
Hey, great to see you, Eric.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for inviting us back.
Well, it's great to have you on because this is a topic that we've been kicking around in the background with all of the AI hype sort of zooming around above us. But the reality is we start thinking about what we've got to do in terms of effectively delivering data to feed the AI beast. The fundamental piece in all this is that storage, our environments are where all of the important data is. And yet, it seems like there's a movement in some quarters sort of charge off and build net new data capabilities just for AI, all sorts of different things that are out there. But it would be great to get your perspectives on where we're headed and what you really think about all this.
I'll kick off on that, Eric, because I think my market is the one that's doing the chasing. And for those who don't know me, I'm the research director of storage. I cover things from the storage perspective, and I don't think it's any secret. If I'm looking at my vendors and the people that I work with on the research side, it's clear that the storage industry, storage market is looking to adjacents for them to expand their revenue opportunities and also to make sure that they stick around long term in this highly chaotic market coming to play. When we start looking at the adjacents, a lot of the obvious things have happened already, right? We've seen a lot of convergence between storage and data protection along with security. A lot of that's being driven by ransomware, and you see everybody trying to pull these things together, and more organizations are adding those adjacent capabilities on the storage side. Maybe it's things like ransomware detection. They're putting them in the arrays. They're doing those different things there, to make sure that they can provide value for their customers and help with that use case and with that requirement of I need resilient infrastructure for ransomware. Well, one of these other adjacents is also going to be on the data side of things and the AI side, which we're talking about here with Jim today. And from our perspective, I think when I'm looking at that, to me, the key words are data services. That seems to be the big term. From a storage perspective, what the storage infrastructure players are saying is that, hey, we've already got a lot of your key data here. Guess what? Our storage arrays, some of them have processing power, or we can arrange to have giving the processing power there. Why don't we bring AI to your data instead of you dragging around your AI to another cloud or to another infrastructure or other things like that? So part of that adjacency is, hey, if we had data services, that's our way to add these other functionalities that aren't traditionally storage functionality to that infrastructure, and allows customers to get more value out of their storage investment now, and also, potentially maybe saving time on, data processing and data access, especially if the storage and AI are residing on the same physical hardware or within the same physical data center. So it's a lot easier to move and locate data and do that processing. What are you seeing on your side, Jim?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let me just say it. My name is Jim Curtis. I'm an analyst here at 451, and I certainly I have been covering database for the better part of a decade. So I think what's interesting is that databases and storage have always had kind of this interesting relationship in a sense that at the heart of a database is certainly its management system, where it allows you to sort of access and control and control the administrative functions of that database and the data it provides. But the storage is always something that's accessed. But over the years, particularly, it's been very interesting is that, you've seen the rise of object storage and data lakes, data lake houses and stuff that have certainly relied on that and the innovations that come. And that literally has brought the databases into more sort of a malleable sort of storage light, I guess, if you will. I guess the challenge is that what's certainly wagging the dog here. Is it the database management system or is it the data? Because certainly, Henry, on your side, you're seeing that because of AI pressures and the enormity of data that you need to either, train models, do applications, AI just data hungry in general, right? And who holds the data and what are you going to operate and do on that data? And so are you going to come at it from a data side or are you going to come at it from sort of a database management side? And so these worlds are converging in a way that, at least at best making both sides, slightly uncomfortable. But at the same time, we're existing because we ultimately want the same goal, and that is we want performant AI based outcomes. Whether that's accurate responses, better chatbots, better models, all this kind of stuff, and all that stuff requires data.
Well, and it seems like the storage providers have got a reasonable case to make. They've done what is the really hard thing that most organizations have typically been really bad at, which is classifying data. Now, granted, they haven't had a lot of context around it, to know what the enterprise value is of that data, but they do know a lot of critical things about the nature of the data. And things like, in order to optimize your storage environment, you have to know who's accessed it, how often, what's the nature of that data. If you're getting more sophisticated, like ransomware protection, you're starting to look at how often it's been accessed and are there changes to that. So there's a lot of intrinsic knowledge in those storage environments that they've had to get really good at in order to do optimization for doing things like deduplication, compression, all the kinds of things, and backup, all the kinds of things that require greater sophistication. And in a lot of cases, they're actually starting to look at the nature of those storage capabilities themselves. Jim, to your point, they're starting to understand, oh, this blob or this chunk of blocks or whatever, it is a database. It's a virtual machine. It's now they know enough about it to maybe do something interesting. And of course, the big challenge with AI is figuring out, all right, I only want to provide my model with the most recent data to train on, and it seems like we see more and more issues day in and day out of people sort of turning loose their AI environments and training them on all the data they own, and then realizing, oh, holy cow, those things from a decade ago, we actually don't want to train on them because they're not relevant anymore, or they're outdated, or they're wrong. And maybe there's some of this other data that is more relevant, and trying to make decisions around that is also relatively complicated. So on the storage side, hey, they seem to, on one level, have the keys to all of solving this problem, but they don't necessarily have the context. Are there other pieces to that they need?
Yeah. So on that side, Eric, I mean, you're absolutely right. Is that I think one of the benefits that storage can bring is their ability to sort of hone in on that storage piece, where traditionally, database vendors have been, all about, maybe the types of data we can store, vectors being a new one. Is it tabular? Is it, analytical data, columnar data, and some of these other things. But it's oftentimes been about performance and speed and resiliency and stuff. And maybe that storage piece hasn't been sort of concentrated enough because again, from the database side, it's always been sort of an outsource. It's always been like an attached piece, right? And you sort of get what you get from that vendor. And so in that sense, yes, this is heightened awareness, particularly with AI. It's putting pressure now on that storage piece. And if all your data is now sitting in storage farms and things like that, like that's all of a sudden now extremely valuable data. And how best can you process that, right? So.
So how do we dive into that? And Henry, are there storage aspects of that uh, do they have the means to be able to make that real claim? And what I guess what does that marriage start to look like? And how do you balance out the needs both, from the database side, which again fundamentally structured typically approaches, storage, to it may or may not be structured, but certainly a lot of data. How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I think the reason why this debate is so interesting is because it's so close. Right. I think the argument I'll make is storage innovation is important, but my argument is that I don't think the storage people necessarily or the storage industry gets to determine when things actually get needed or used. Right. If we start looking, let's take a look at the AI market and some of the things that have happened interesting in storage there just recently. You're seeing, more and more of these players coming in with parallel file systems, right? Because, we need to feed our GPUs for training. Let's go do parallel file system stuff. Parallel file system stuff has been around for decades. Decades. It's the heart of all the stuff we do in HPC and all these really crazy, the Ferrari of workloads type aspirational crazy stuff that's out there. That's where that market was. Because AI needed it, suddenly that technology, which most enterprises weren't going to use unless they're doing HPC, now suddenly they're looking at those things. So I think what that proves to me is that, yes, those innovations or some of these innovations happening on the storage side are going to be important and could be implemented in ways that maybe we don't even think about later. But I think ultimately it's going to be on Jim's side of the fence and those people who are making the workload decisions, the AI decisions, or which BI platform or which other database we're going to deploy. I think they're the ones that have control of the throttle as to, do we really need this now? Well, tell me what you could do for me. Like if this is going to make my processing or data loads like blah, blah, blah faster, and I don't have my really smart, expensive people sitting around waiting for days for stuff to get loaded up, maybe they're willing to pay for that. But I think it's going to come down to, I think that's why the debate's interesting, because I think it's going to come down to both sides agreeing, and for each organization, they're going to have to decide, should they be going down more this storage-centric route and take advantage of those capabilities and some of these home court advantages they have by using that, or should they potentially look on the other sides or other innovations that are not what they've been doing for years in their existing infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point. I mean, Henry, I mean this idea that if you look at storage as sort of a discrete sort of commodity, is it new oil, the new water, or whatever. Like by itself, it has it has a certain level of value, but it needs to be operated on, right? And if we're suggesting that on the database side, it brings that operational, that compute element to that, there's some truth in that. At the same time, the database vendors, they're building databases. They're not necessarily building out like super robust storage systems, right? So there's this like, we need them, but maybe we'll just, there's kind of this side eye look, but this just doesn't get a lot of mention. But the other aspect of this, Eric, I think what's interesting is that we're just the sheer amount of data, right? That's databases inherently have some limits, right? They can only store so much, or they can distribute it so much before, fundamentally you can only distribute so far, or, horizontally scale or horizontally up before you reach some limits, right? From the database storage side, from Henry's side, is that like, if you integrate all that, you get around some of those limits. So it just puts a certain intriguing element into this debate, particularly as we head towards AI, right? And there's certainly, Henry can speak to, some storage vendors that are sort of pushing the limits on, on some of those boundaries. But it's just an interesting dichotomy on these two industries sort of coming together around this common thing of data.
So I'll stick a metaphor out there.
Sure.
Is this harking back to the Wizard of Oz? Is this the database vendors, being the great and powerful Oz, and AI being Toto, who's sort of pulling the curtain back and realizing that, oh, geez, behind all that is actually all the storage stuff. Is that what's happened? Is AI the Toto in this equation? And more importantly, should people not pay attention to the man behind the curtain?
We want to draw, sort of a clear line between the two areas. I don't know if the database vendors truly have the autonomy, right? Because sometimes things are just driven by need, or they're driven by the market tells you what is needed, right? But there should, there might be some arrogance, or comeuppance just in terms of like, what we think we can influence, but in reality we can't. But that's an interesting metaphor, Eric. I don't know, Henry, if your thoughts on that. So
Yeah, I still see things more from the storage side, and
Yeah.
I come back to the same thing. The store market's chasing, right? I mean, they need to be valuable in the next market. They need to be part of these conversations going forward. And I think that's why they're driving so much of this consolidation or this drive to consolidate. I think the other thing we have to think about is as we start looking at these, you know, AI infrastructures becoming more production oriented and we start thinking about compliance, resiliency, higher levels of performance, all these other elements, guess what? Those are all enterprise storage type capabilities. So as we look at these things and what happens with RAG, what happens if I want to protect my models, what happens if there's a ransomware attack, all these different things are going to become more and more important things going forward. And I think what the storage people want to do is make sure that not only they uh, in the conversation or in the mix as we're developing and testing and trying to decide what we're trying to do. But as we start ramping those up and they become more production and there's more opportunities to provide other value, whether it be the resiliency or data distribution or better search or or better capabilities in terms of what we could add on the data intelligence side, all those things wind up becoming even more and more valuable afterwards. So I think that's why the storage people have so much pressure now to make sure that they're in the conversations and inserting themselves now when some of those innovators may not even know anything about the storage players. It's important for them to get into the mix now because the longer term of this is where they're going to make a lot of the money and a lot of these service contracts and things like that tie the customer closer to the vendors.
They need to be part of that to ensure that they're part of that conversation. And yet, they've got the core aspects of this. And you mentioned an interesting point about knowing more about what's happening, not only with the data, but with the constructs that exist above it, things like models. Storage vendors have gotten really good at being able to understand the mechanics of dealing with complex collections of storage for things like virtual machines.
Along that line, it's not just storage. When I say storage, it's not just the storage systems. There's actually a lot of interesting things happening at the backup side as well. I was at the VM conference recently and they were showing their new integration with like MCP, where they could be forwarding, like imagine that with MCP, for those, that's Model Context Protocol. It allows large language models to talk to themselves or talk to other software elements. They were showing how they could talk to Claude from Anthropic to ask the VM things, questions about their data. That's the type of world that we're getting into. I mean, you look at backup, you think, oh, maybe backup's kind of boring, but what's the advantage that backup has? Backup sees all the data. If I see all the data and I'm retaining all the data, guess what? I'm in a good position to classify that data, identify that data, analyze that data, add other types of value propositions to that data because it's even better because that's not the production data. That was our safety copy in the back. So when we start looking at these things, there's other value propositions that could happen. And a lot of those things could help address some of the problems that Jim and their stakeholders may be having in terms of making sure they have the best data quality and making sure they have the fastest access to that data, where they're not looking around forever or not using the wrong version by accident.
Well, and it gets right back to that point that you're identifying, which is they've already got all the information. They have had to go build a detailed understanding about what that data looks like. They just need to be able to extend that context. And one way that they get to do even more context is for not only AI and the storage, that collaborative effort, but the AI for storage in the example that you're identifying, in which, hey, if you can ask questions, if you can apply AI capabilities to do analytics on your storage environment, there's a lot you can start to pull out of that as well. And that's now we start to blur these lines. We're talking about being able to get greater computational horsepower next into the storage arrays or next to the storage arrays. I know there are a number of vendors that are starting to talk about dropping GPUs into storage array environments, so you can actually do the analytics right there. As you said, performant access to data is going to reduce training times, and now we're starting to get into a whole set of tangled interactions around this. I mean, hey, it's good to have options, but it sounds like this starts to make some of the decision making around how this gets built, how you leverage what you got, what you need to go look at that's net new, in a much more complex environment.
It's interesting because in the database world, the idea of moving data is always this taboo thing, right? That's you pay a cost to that. So if you want to bring, you know, efficiently, if you want to bring if you want to bring efficiency to it, you take the compute to where the data is, right? I mean, I hear this all the time, right? We're going to take the compute to the data, right? Um, uh, and and if you look at sort of Henry's world into where he's living, like you know what's the true reality of that? The true reality is that now you've got storage systems that are acting and looking like databases, right? Like they're sort of functioning that way because that's where the data lives, right? This data gravity thing, right? It's a real deal, right? So um so be careful what you ask for, because that's fundamentally kind of what this is setting up for, right? Where we've often talked about it, we're going to take the compute where the storage is, and sometimes that's referred to of like, maybe where object storage is, or we have an engine that can query other databases and then process that place. But I'm not sure it's been looked at to the detail of like actually taking compute to the storage layer.
Well, and it gets to that question of, or at least the question that the hyperscaler cloud providers pose, which is we've got compute, we've got storage, they're all really close. So just simply bring all your data to us. We'll slice and dice it in whatever way works. We've got vast quantities of computational power to turn loose on this. All you have to do is ship us all your data. That's all.
Or if you already have it, right? It's already there. You just add some compute. Yeah. So
that starts getting into that other question. Henry, I'm curious, what's your take on? I mean, clearly, the big question that we hear a lot is issues of data security, and sovereignty. Data sovereignty plays a role there. That has been that trump card that many of the storage providers play. Uh, how does an organization work around that and make intelligent decisions about placement and where they go, both short and long term?
Yeah, unfortunately, data placement's one of those tricky issues because there's no one size fits all, and every organization is going to be a little bit different. Yeah, I think on the data distribution side, I mean, then you start looking at sovereignty issues and can data reside here in this cloud or not? If it can't, then you're kind of out of choices, right? Then that means you have to create another environment or another service provider either within your uh, the country you want to be in, or on your own private hardware to do that. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting issues going forward in terms of where that data resides and why. Yeah, as Jim said, I mean, there is that value proposition of not having to move the data. And that's not a trivial thing, right? If we're talking about big data sets, like petabytes of data sets, even if you're moving that over the wire, that could take a long time. And if you want it faster, the crazy thing is you're probably gonna have to do physical shipment of that. That's not fun either, right? Nobody's gonna want to physically ship data out there with
yeah,
logistics costs the way they are and things like that. Those are all challenges as well. So yeah, there are going to be these challenges on the data mobility side, especially as we deal with larger and larger unstructured data workloads to potentially move for that processing.
Yeah, I mean, AWS Snowball is a thing because FedEx can, well, and whether or not it's FedEx, whether or not it's a tractor trailer full of storage, it can oftentimes move that data faster than the connectivity that you actually have at your location. And that, like, again, that we start to get into the actual physical world constraints in terms of what it's going to take to move all that data, and that's not simple.
to your earlier point, Henry, the idea is that certain database architectures actually lend themselves to sovereignty laws and placement, because you can sort of set up instances and
Hmm.
and things, and then they can connect. If you if you sort of pull back that layer, and what if we're sort of a shared everything environment, right? You're dealing with just massive amounts of data sets, potentially in one location, right? So it certainly raises these questions about this, right? Is on one hand, you like the idea of having consolidated data, and the benefits of that, and the speed and performance, and bringing compute to that. But on the other hand, you still have to get around, potentially islands or sovereignty laws with, certain architectures, database architectures that allow for that. So it can be interesting to see how this sort of winds itself together, over the next few years.
So what should organizations be looking out for And I guess as we've been discussing, there is no one size fits all. But are we heading towards a world in which there's more storage in database, more database in storage, or are we already there?
I'll take a stab at that, and then I'll let Henry sort of wrap up. But the idea is that database development is a long game. It's like building planets. I mean, this is not for the faint of heart. I mean, this is heavy stuff. I mean, it takes years, even decades to build a good enterprise database out there, right? And so this switch between, or this conundrum between, what's happening on the storage side, what's happening on the database side, may take a little bit of time to play out. What I think is going to happen, though, is I think from the storage side, I think there's enough pressure put on database vendors that they won't be able to ignore it. They won't be able to ignore some of the benefits that are going on here. And are going to have to sort of play in this game a little bit better, right? That's my idea. But are we looking at maybe next year storage as database vendors? That's probably not in the immediate future, but the pressure is on the database market right now to listen to see what's going on from storage, because they are contributing to it. So
Yeah, and from a storage perspective, I think, as we mentioned, I mean, there are challenges today that are going to require you may potentially need these storage technologies. Maybe it is that training issue, and you need to come in and bring in a parallel file system, be able to feed GPUs or whatever else. Or it could be the other things like, well, we're going to do RAGs. Well, how do you do the guardrails? What should be in the data management? What should be in the data ops for that? That's another area where the storage can play. And then also the recovery scenarios that we talked about earlier. Are you going to have a different recovery practice and capabilities and technology stack compared to what your other applications are? Well, we'll see as those things progress out. But there might be consolidation elements there that could be very beneficial if you work on those. If the customer is able to consolidate these things and you consolidate some of their management and other type of capabilities there.
And it's always that drive to be able to simplify the operational piece. Although with the headlong drive towards AI in all its various forms is certainly moving people forward. Well, I guess we'll have to see where this winds up and bring you back to see how this happens to evolve. But we're at time for this episode. But this has been a great conversation. Thanks to you both.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
That is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Farhan Miadayoshan, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. Please join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about the journey from risk to resilience and looking at some of the things that are a fundamental part of architecting your environments and where they fit. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.